Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight we enter the world of Miss Marple in a mystery known as Miss Marple and the Riddle, written in baking measurements. A village recipe hides a deadly clue and a secret measured in silence. Where are you joining us from tonight? Now, pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon that the matter of the baking measurements first began, though none of the good ladies of St. Mary Mead could have imagined it then. The Women's Institute had gathered in the parish hall, its draughty windows and slightly uneven floorboards made more inviting by the scent of cinnamon scones, nutmeg-flecked shortbread, and a rich ginger cake which Mrs. Clement declared was her finest attempt yet. The long trestle tables were covered with white cloths and dotted with plates of home-baked fare. Teapots steamed merrily, cups clinked, and voices rose and fell with the pleasant rhythm of gossip. At the far end of the table, Miss Jane Marple sat, her neat gloved hands folded on her lap. She was not speaking much, though she was listening, and those who knew her well would have noticed the faint quirk of amusement about her eyes whenever a particularly fanciful tale was exchanged. Mrs. Bantry, enthusiastic as always, leaned over to exclaim that the ginger cake was a triumph. Mrs. Price Ridley countered, a touch sharply, that it was rather overbaked. Mrs. Clement blushed, protested, and was quickly comforted by the vicar's wife. Such minor skirmishes in the genteel battlefield of cakes and puddings were nothing unusual. What was unusual, though, the village ladies did not at once realize it was the sudden silence that fell when Miss Margaret Hargreaves, a middle-aged spinster of precise habits and rather too much starch in her collars, stood at the front with a notebook in hand. "Before we begin our customary singing of the harvest hymn," she announced, "I should like to share with you a curious paper that has come into my possession. It was slipped into the Institute suggestion box, unsigned. At first glance, it seems to be nothing more than a list of baking measurements. Yet when I read it more carefully, it struck me as odd. Perhaps one of you cleverer ladies can explain it." There was a ripple of curiosity. Miss Hargreaves adjusted her spectacles and read aloud, 2 ounces of regret, 1½ teaspoons of deceit, a heaping cup of silence, 3 tablespoons of envy, sifted, bake until discovery. A flutter of laughter and exclamations ran around the hall. "Someone's little joke," said Mrs. Bantry with a smile. "A parody of a recipe. How delightful." But Miss Marple's keen blue eyes did not share the laughter. She was watching Miss Hargreaves, noting how the woman's hand trembled slightly as she held the paper. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that tremors of that kind were not always caused by nerves alone. "It is very curious," Miss Marple said quietly in her gentle, unassuming way. "Almost like a riddle, don't you think? A recipe for something that is not altogether wholesome." Several of the ladies tittered, but Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Some silly girl with too much imagination," she declared. "Or perhaps a child playing tricks." The vicar frowned. If it is a child, it is rather a morbid jest. The paper was passed from hand to hand, each member peering at the list of odd ingredients, and it might have ended as a moment of harmless amusement had it not been for what occurred scarcely half an hour later. The gathering was breaking up, chairs scraping as the ladies prepared to leave, when a piercing cry echoed from the small anteroom beside the kitchen. Teacups rattled, and several women rushed forward. There, amid the coats and hats piled high, lay Mrs. Clement herself, collapsed upon the wooden floor. Her fair hair had come loose from its pins, and her face was shockingly pale. The smell of ginger cake still clung to her dress, but her lips were twisted in a grimace of pain. A shattered teacup lay beside her, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the boards. "She's fainted!" cried Mrs. Bantry, dropping to her knees. But even as she said it, there was something in the stillness of Mrs. Clement's form that suggested more than a faint. The doctor was summoned with all haste, but it was soon evident that Mrs. Clement would never again bustle about her kitchen or boast of her sponge cakes. The verdict quietly spoken, was unmistakable. She had been poisoned. The women of St. Mary Mead, who only moments before had been discussing flour and sugar, now stood in shocked clusters, whispering in horrified tones. Poison, in their own institute, and the victim is one of their own. The police, of course, were sent for, and Inspector Slack arrived with his usual briskness, notebook in hand and suspicion already gleaming in his eye. He was quick to begin questioning. Who had poured the tea? Who had been near the cakes? Did anyone have reason to dislike Mrs. Clement? And here, inevitably, the whispers began. Mrs. Clement, for all her charm in public, had not been without her quarrels. There were mutterings about her sharp tongue at the last fete, her dispute with Mrs. Price Ridley over committee funds, her long-standing rivalry with Mrs. Hargreaves in matters of baking supremacy. Even her husband's absence was noted in a tone that suggested it might conceal some mystery of its own. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly, her hands folded once more. She watched as the inspector scrawled impatiently, watched as the ladies offered their theories with more eagerness than accuracy. And she thought, with that inward clarity that had come from years of observing human nature, that the curious paper of baking measurements might not have been a joke after all. It might very well be a cryptic, symbolic, and deadly serious message. But Miss Marple said nothing. She never hurried these matters. She merely tucked away each detail, each careless remark, each tremor of a hand, and stored it in that tidy, disciplined mind of hers, for she knew, as surely as she knew the pattern of her own garden, that human malice often dressed itself in the clothes of the ordinary, just as poison could lie hidden in a simple cup of tea. And so it was that a quiet village afternoon, filled with the scents of cinnamon and nutmeg, turned suddenly into a matter of life and death. And Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, began to thread together the riddle written in baking measurements. Morning in St. Mary Mead was never entirely silent. The distant chime of the church bell, the bark of a restless dog, and the creak of bicycle wheels on the lane were all part of its accustomed rhythm. Yet on the day following Mrs. Clement's sudden death, the hum of village life took on a different tone. It was not simply routine that stirred the air, but speculation. The Women's Institute had never provided quite so much fodder for whispers. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry leaned across the counter with a packet of tea in her hand, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial pitch. It was dreadful. Simply dreadful, Mr. Sims. I was there myself. One moment she was laughing about her ginger cake. The next she was quite gone. And the look on her face, I shall never forget it. Mr. Sims, usually more concerned with weighing sugar than listening to scandal, could not resist this morsel. And they say it was poison, Mrs. Bantry. Poison, right there in the parish hall. That is what the inspector believes, she replied with a meaningful glance. Though of course there will be an inquest. Still, it is not natural to collapse like that, not in the middle of a tea. Half an hour later, the same story had crossed into the Drapers, slightly altered in detail, for Mrs. Bantry's version now included a mysterious paper slipped into the suggestion box, which she described with the air of one recounting a chilling ghost story. The odd recipe of regret and envy had become an object of fascination. By the time the tale reached the butcher's, it was widely assumed that Mrs. Clement's death and the paper were linked beyond question. Miss Marple, who preferred to do her errands in the quieter mid-morning, heard fragments of these tales as she passed through the high street. She paused outside the post office to exchange a few words with Miss Hartnell, who wasted no time in announcing that she suspected Mrs. Price Ridley. She was glaring daggers at poor Mrs. Clement all through the meeting, Miss Hartnell insisted. And don't tell me you didn't see it, Miss Marple, because I know you notice everything. Miss Marple gave her a mild smile. I had the impression Mrs. Price Ridley was perhaps not best pleased about the ginger cake, she admitted. But disapproval of a recipe dear Miss Hartnell, is rather a different matter from a deadly crime." Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. "You'll see. Mark my words. There's something in it." And with that, she marched off, triumphant in her certainty. The truth, however, was less tidy. Inspector Slack had spent much of the morning questioning members of the Institute, to varying degrees of success. He was certain that someone had tampered with the tea, but whether it was the cup, the milk, or the sugar remained maddeningly unclear. The tea service had been communal, and everyone had dipped into the same pots and bowls. Slack, never a patient man, grew increasingly irritated by what he termed women's fussing. Miss Marple, who had been present at some of these interviews, quietly observed the exchanges. She noted how Mrs. Bantry, though eager to assist, frequently strayed into colourful anecdotes, how Mrs. Price Ridley answered every question with excessive sharpness, as though offended by suspicion itself, and how Miss Hargreaves grew nervous whenever the strange paper was mentioned, her fingers twitching at the edge of her sleeve. Back in her neat little cottage, Miss Marple reflected as she wound wool for her knitting. She did not yet know who had poisoned Mrs. Clement, but she knew something about human nature. People rarely act without a motive, and motives in a village were often wrapped up in long-standing quarrels, small jealousies, or matters of pride. A murder, in Miss Marple's eyes, was never truly sudden. It was the final bloom of seeds sown long before. Across the village, others were forming their own theories. At the Blue Boar Inn, a few of the men speculated loudly over pints, suggesting that Mrs. Clement's husband had grown weary of her endless baking competitions. In the schoolyard, the children whispered about a secret recipe book that could kill anyone who read from it, a tale likely lifted from some lurid penny magazine. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Clement's absence was keenly felt, for she had been among the most active members of the parish committees, and her duties would now fall to others. The funeral arrangements were already being discussed. Mrs. Bantry declared it would be the most attended service in recent memory. Grief was mingled with curiosity, for even in sorrow, the villagers could not resist wondering who might have slipped poison into a teacup. And with each retelling of the event, the story grew darker, the suspects more numerous. Miss Marple, though she listened to all these tales, kept her own counsel. She spent a little longer than usual in her garden that afternoon, pruning her roses with delicate precision. As she snipped away a faded bloom, she thought of how gossip spread in the village just as roses did, each cutting producing new growth, until one scarcely knew where the first stem had begun. In gossip lay both truth and error, and she had long ago learned that among the weeds one might occasionally find a telling bloom. When evening came, Miss Marple lit her lamp and sat by the fire. She took out her notebook and, in her neat hand, copied down the words of the peculiar recipe as she remembered them. 2 ounces of regret, 1½ teaspoons of deceit, a heaping cup of silence, 3 tablespoons of envy, sifted. Bake until discovery. She considered each word in turn. Regret, deceit, silence, envy. They were not culinary matters at all, but human ones. It was a recipe not for a cake, but for a crime, and someone in St. Mary Mead had followed it, step by step. Outside, the village settled into uneasy quiet, curtains drawn and doors locked earlier than usual. The shadows of autumn lengthened, and in every sitting room, the same conversation persisted. Who had wanted Mrs. Clement dead? Was it truly poison? And what did the riddle in the baking measurements mean? Only Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, seemed content not to rush to judgment, for she knew that in such cases, time was as vital an ingredient as any other. One could not hurry the rising of bread, nor the revealing of human malice. Both required watching, waiting, and knowing precisely when to open the oven door. The next morning dawned with a thin mist clinging to the hedgerows, lending the lanes of St. Mary Mead a hushed, almost watchful quality. The villagers, however, were anything but quiet. Already the shops were alive with murmurings, and the postmistress reported that she had never heard so many people inquire about the daily newspaper at such an early hour. They wanted, of course, to see whether Mrs. Clement's death had been mentioned in print. It had, though only as a brief notice that spoke of sudden illness under investigation. The words were vague, but vague words often invited more speculation than facts. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement's absence had created a kind of vacuum. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Haydock, found herself busier than ever with parish matters, and had little time to reflect, though she did remark that the Institute would not be the same without Mrs. Clement's indefatigable presence. The vicar himself sighed often, muttering that it was a poor thing when the devil found his way into teacups. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was not content with sighs. He had spent the better part of the morning arranging for a thorough examination of the remaining food from the parish hall. He was convinced the poison must have slipped into something consumed only by the victim, though it was an irksome puzzle that others had partaken of the same tea and cakes without harm. His constables carried away samples in paper wrappings, though he muttered darkly about the hopeless muddle of it all. Miss Marple, invited by Mrs. Bantry, took tea at the hall that afternoon, listening as her friend recounted the latest theories. "You know, Jane, there are people saying it was the milk. Others swear it was the sugar, and some even think she ate something special she kept aside for herself. Personally, I cannot help thinking it was deliberate. But who could have wished her dead?" Miss Marple stirred her cup with quiet deliberation. "That is always the question, Dolly. People seldom commit dreadful acts without reason. Sometimes the reason is quite small, at least in the eyes of others, but to the one who acts, it looms very large indeed." Mrs. Bantry gave her a shrewd look. "You have someone in mind, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet. Only impressions. Mrs. Clement was a woman of strong opinions. Strong opinions have a way of making enemies. The inspector, for his part, was more forthright. He had already summoned Mrs. Price Ridley for questioning, as the quarrel over the Institute's funds was well known. She denied hotly that she bore Mrs. Clement any malice beyond the occasional irritation at committee meetings. Her answers, though brisk, rang with a kind of indignant honesty. Slack left her house dissatisfied, but not convinced of guilt. Next, he turned his attention to Miss Hargreaves, who had read the peculiar recipe aloud. She appeared flustered and spoke in a hesitant manner, explaining that she had only thought the paper a harmless oddity. Yet when pressed about where she had found it, she grew vague, saying only that it had been in the box when she checked it that morning. Slack noted the evasion, but had little to pin upon her. All the while, Miss Marple quietly pieced together the threads. She thought again of the recipe and its strange measurements. 2 ounces of regret, 1½ teaspoons of deceit, a heaping cup of silence, 3 tablespoons of envy, sifted. It was an oddity, yes, but she had lived long enough to know that oddities were rarely without purpose. It seemed to her that the author had been making a statement, perhaps even a confession, though couched in the language of baking to disguise its weight. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with her knitting needles flashing steadily. Through the open window drifted the faint scent of wood smoke, for the nights had grown chill. She considered the people she had known in the village for years, their petty quarrels and long-standing friendships. She thought of Mrs. Clement's sharp words in committee, of her triumphs and rivalries at the fete, and of her tendency to dominate conversation with her latest recipes. Little things, perhaps, but in small communities, little things could become as sharp as daggers. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar's wife, pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, I do not know why I felt compelled to come, but I must tell someone. I cannot shake the memory of that paper Miss Hargreaves read. It is haunting me. Don't you think it means something? Something dreadful?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "It may indeed mean something, though the truth is often less dramatic than our imaginations suggest. Still, it is wise to pay attention to the small oddities. They often lead us closer to understanding. The vicar's wife looked both reassured and troubled. She soon departed, leaving Miss Marple once again in the quiet company of her thoughts. By the end of that day, the village had settled into an uneasy pattern. The shops and lanes hummed with speculation, while Inspector Slack busied himself with interviews and tests. Yet beneath the surface, chatter lay something more profound, a sense that the village's comfortable order had been unsettled. For if poison could be slipped into a cup of tea in the parish hall, then safety was no longer something to be taken for granted. Miss Marple, gazing at the shadows lengthening in her little garden, knew that the true investigation had only just begun. And as she closed her notebook with the words of the riddle neatly copied out, she resolved to watch, to listen, and to wait for the moment when the pattern revealed itself. For it would reveal itself, of that she was certain. Human nature, like a recipe, followed its ingredients faithfully, and sooner or later, the cake would rise. By the third day after Mrs. Clement's death, the air in St. Mary Mead had thickened with suspicion. What had begun as whispers in the grocer's queue now carried openly across garden fences and over tea tables. It was as though the entire village had become a jury, each inhabitant pronouncing guilt or innocence according to their own prejudices and partialities. Inspector Slack was quick to seize upon this atmosphere, for gossip often offered him a starting point, even if the details required trimming and shaping. He arrived that morning at the vicarage, his boots leaving a trail of mud on the path, and announced that he intended to narrow his field of suspects. "We can't have the whole village under suspicion," he declared brusquely. "We'll begin with those who had cause to dislike her, and there are a fair few." Mrs. Price Ridley's name was once more at the forefront. Her quarrel with Mrs. Clement over the Institute's funds had not gone unnoticed, and more than one villager remembered sharp words exchanged at the last committee meeting. Slack paid her another visit, his manner more pointed this time. She defended herself with hauteur, insisting that she would never stoop to such a dreadful act, though the inspector noted how her voice sharpened whenever Mrs. Clement's name was mentioned. Then there was Miss Hargreaves, whose reading of the strange recipe had set the entire chain of events into sharper relief. She seemed uncomfortable under questioning, repeating that she had no idea who had written the paper and that she had only intended to amuse the gathering by reading it aloud. Her protestations, however, grew flustered the longer the inspector pressed, and Slack muttered to himself that guilt often showed itself in nerves. And there was another name on many lips, Mr. Clement himself. Though absent from the Institute tea, he was not beyond suspicion. There were mutterings about his indifference to his wife's enthusiasms, about late evenings spent at the E.I. Blue Boar, about an inheritance that might be more easily enjoyed without his wife's watchful eye. Slack, ever inclined to see a straightforward motive, found the idea appealing. Her husband was a tidy suspect, with financial gain a motive easily explained. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed all of this from her quiet corner. She listened to Mrs. Bantry's animated reports, to Miss Hartnell's declarations of certainty, and to the vicar's wife, who insisted that such evil could never have sprung from among their parishioners. She herself said very little, but her knitting needles clicked steadily as she considered the matter. It was true that Mrs. Price Ridley bore a grievance, but Miss Marple had seen women quarrel fiercely over committee matters, and yet attend each other's funerals in genuine sorrow. Miss Hargreaves's nerves might be nothing more than the fluttering of a timid heart confronted with tragedy. And as for Mr. Clement, Miss Marple found herself doubting whether he possessed the energy to undertake something so deliberate. His indolence was almost a byword in the village. Still, she did not dismiss any possibility outright. Human nature was too complex for easy judgments. A quarrel that seemed trivial to one might fester into bitterness for another. A timid spirit might be driven to desperate acts when pressed. Even indolence, she knew, did not rule out cunning. The inspector, however, was eager to make progress. He convened a small gathering in the parish hall, summoning Mrs. Price. Ridley, Miss Hargreaves, and Mr. Clement for questioning in the presence of a constable. The villagers, hearing of this, gathered outside in curious clusters, straining to catch a word or a glimpse. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Mrs. Price Ridley sat bolt upright, her expression one of outrage. "I will not be treated like a criminal," she announced. "If you think I had anything to do with this, you are quite mistaken." Yes, Mrs. Clement and I disagreed, but who in this village did not disagree with her at one time or another? She was a woman who invited quarrels. Miss Hargreaves wrung her hands, stammering that she had nothing to hide. When asked again about the paper, she claimed she had destroyed it after the meeting, which sent a murmur of disapproval through the room. It was only nonsense, she insisted, though her voice shook. Mr. Clement, by contrast, was almost too calm. He shrugged when asked about his wife's death, saying only that it was a shock and that he had no idea how it could have happened. His indifference unsettled many, though Miss Marple thought it the indifference of a man unaccustomed to displaying feeling rather than the cunning of a guilty mind. By the end of the session, Inspector Slack had convinced himself that the matter pointed most strongly toward Mrs. Price Ridley or Miss Hargreaves. He left the hall with an air of satisfaction, already imagining how neatly he might tie the threads together. Miss Marple, however, left with a different impression. To her, the gathering had revealed less about guilt and more about character. She had seen the sharpness of pride in Mrs. Price Ridley, the tremor of fear in Miss Hargreaves, and the weary detachment of Mr. Clement. They were ingredients, each of them, but whether they composed the final recipe remained to be seen. As she walked home through the lanes, the evening sun casting long shadows across the hedgerows, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar paper once more. Regret, deceit, silence, envy. Each of the suspects displayed some portion of these qualities, yet none seemed to encompass them all. She had the sense that the riddle pointed not to the obvious quarrels, but to something subtler, something concealed beneath the everyday chatter of village life. In her sitting room that night, she set aside her knitting and opened her notebook again. She drew a small diagram, placing each name beside the words of the recipe. Price Ridley with envy, Hargreaves with silence, Clement with regret. Yet there was still deceit unaccounted for, and it was deceit that most often poisoned a village from within. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently. The inspector might be satisfied with his suspects for now, but she knew the story was far from complete. Human motives, like baking mixtures, required careful sifting. And in St. Mary Mead, the sifting had only just begun. The morning after Inspector Slack's gathering in the parish hall, the village was restless. Rumour had taken on a sharper edge. It was no longer merely a matter of speculation over tea. There was now a sense that guilt hovered close, like smoke that would not disperse. The names of Mrs. Price Ridley, Miss Hargreaves, and Mr. Clement were spoken with lowered voices, and every gesture, every word they uttered was weighed and measured by their neighbours. Miss Marple, however, did not allow herself to be swept along by the tide of gossip. She walked slowly through the high street, pausing to greet the shopkeepers and listen to their remarks. To the casual eye, she was the picture of mildness, but beneath her quiet manner she was watching, storing each detail as carefully as a housewife might store preserves in her larder. It was at the grocer's that she overheard something that made her pause. Miss Hartnell, speaking rather too loudly as usual, was telling Mrs. Bantry that she had seen Mrs. Clement leave the parish hall kitchen briefly on the afternoon of the tea, only to return with a small envelope in her hand. "I thought nothing of it at the time," Miss Hartnell declared, "but now I wonder." She looked flustered, as if she'd been caught out. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "What sort of envelope, do you suppose?" Miss Hartnell pursed her lips. "White. Quite plain." She slipped it into her handbag before anyone else noticed. "I should have mentioned it earlier, but there has been such a flurry of talk." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind sharpened. An envelope could mean many things, but in the light of the mysterious paper found in the suggestion box, the detail was worth noting. It was often such small things, overlooked by others, that proved to be the hinge upon which a larger truth turned. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to walk past the parish hall herself. The building stood solid and unremarkable, with its slightly sagging roof and narrow windows. Yet within its plain walls, secrets had gathered like shadows. The kitchen door stood ajar, and she peered in discreetly. The counters were bare, but one of the drawers had not been fully closed. With a gentle tug, she slid it open and found a scattering of paper scraps, odd clippings, grocery lists, and at the very bottom, a torn corner of heavier paper that looked as if it had once belonged to something more formal. She lifted it delicately. The fragment bore only a few letters, but the texture suggested it was of better quality than common notepaper. Miss Marple slipped it into her glove. It was not proof of anything, but it fitted uneasily with Miss Hartnell's story of an envelope. Why should Mrs. Clement have been carrying slips of heavy paper unless they were connected with a strange recipe that had been read aloud? Meanwhile, Inspector Slack was growing impatient. He had interrogated the first suspects thoroughly, yet no confession had been forthcoming, and no evidence strong enough to warrant an arrest. He had begun to mutter about London experts and laboratories, though in truth he disliked calling in help. It suggested inadequacy, a trait he could not endure in himself. Miss Marple, who encountered him outside the post office, remarked gently, "It must be very difficult to decide, Inspector, when so many of the facts are elusive." Slack snorted. "It's all muddle. Too many women chattering and no one telling the truth. But I'll have my manor woman before long. You'll see." She smiled kindly. "I'm sure you will. Though sometimes the truth hides itself in the smallest corners." He gave her a sharp look, as if half suspecting she was mocking him, but she merely adjusted her hat and moved on. That evening, Miss Marple invited Mrs. Bantry to tea at her cottage. The little parlour, with its chintz curtains and the faint scent of lavender, was as comforting as ever. Yet the conversation soon turned to darker matters. "I cannot help but think," said Mrs. Bantry, "that Miss Hargreaves knows more than she says. She was trembling like a leaf at the hall and destroying that paper well that smacks of guilt to me." Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "Yes, Dolly, it might appear so. Yet fear and guilt can look very much alike. One must be cautious not to confuse them. I have known people to tremble simply because they dislike being questioned." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Well, I leave it to you, Jane. You have the knack of seeing what others miss." Miss Marple did not deny it, though she would never have claimed such ability for herself. She simply knew that human behavior had its patterns, just as baking did. If one studied the ingredients closely enough, one could often predict the outcome. When her friend had gone, she took out the scrap of paper once more. She examined it under the lamplight, tracing the faint lines of print that remained. It was impossible to make out the words, but she fancied it might have been part of a letter or a formal notice. Something about it suggested secrecy. She placed it carefully between the pages of her notebook, alongside the copied recipe of emotions. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple reflected that the clue was small, almost laughably so, yet she felt its significance. A torn scrap of paper, an envelope glimpsed by Miss Hartnell, and a curious recipe that spoke of regret, deceit, silence, and envy. These things were linked. The inspector might scoff, but Miss Marple had learned that the smallest stitch could unravel the largest tapestry. Beyond her window, the village lay quiet under the stars. Yet within that quiet there lingered unease, as though every household felt the weight of suspicion pressing at its doors. Somewhere among them, she thought, the author of that recipe waited, confident still in their concealment. But concealment, like a poorly mixed batter, could not hold forever. One day soon, the lumps would show. The funeral of Mrs. Clement drew half the village to the church, and those who could not fit inside crowded along the churchyard path, whispering behind gloved hands. The service was solemn, but beneath the solemnity lurked speculation. People glanced not at the coffin, but at their neighbors, watching faces, measuring expressions, wondering who among them had poured poison into a teacup. Mr. Clement stood stiffly at the front, his expression unreadable. Some said he looked too calm for a grieving husband, while others argued that his manner was simply one of restraint. Miss Marple, from her pew near the side, noted the faint impatience in the way he shifted his weight, as though enduring the ritual rather than participating in it. It was not proof of guilt, but it was a detail, and she collected details as a magpie collected shiny things. After the service, Inspector Slack took the opportunity to corner Miss Hargreaves in the churchyard. His voice carried to the delight of those eavesdropping. "You destroyed that paper, Miss Hargreaves. That was reckless. What were you hiding?" "I told you," she stammered, color flooding her cheeks. "It was nonsense, and I wished to save us from more morbid talk. I did not know it would become important." Slack leaned in, his pen poised over his notebook. "A convenient excuse? If you ask me, you were afraid that paper would lead straight to you." The poor woman burst into tears, and several matrons rushed forward to comfort her. Miss Marple, who had been observing quietly, thought again how fear and guilt so often wore the same face. It would be easy for the inspector to mistake one for the other. That afternoon, gossip reached a new pitch. Mrs. Bantry paid a visit to Miss Marple, her cheeks flushed with the thrill of scandal. "My dear Jane, you would hardly credit it, but I have heard that Mrs. Clement was not entirely well liked among certain ladies of the parish. There are whispers that she interfered more than once in matters that did not concern her." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "That is hardly news, Dolly, but what sort of interference?" Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "There was talk of her advising the vicar's wife about her household accounts quite uninvited, and it seems she scolded young Sarah Sims, the grocer's daughter, for loitering with a certain young man. People remember such things, Jane, even if they don't speak of them openly." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, indeed. Few things linger as long as unsolicited advice. One may intend to help, but resentment often grows where gratitude does not." Meanwhile, Inspector Slack pursued another line of inquiry. He called upon Mr. Clement at his cottage and questioned him about his wife's affairs. The widower replied tersely, insisting he knew nothing of her committee squabbles and cared even less. Slack pressed him about financial matters, but the man's answers were evasive, not from craftiness, but from weariness, as if life itself were a burden now that his household order had been disrupted. Slack left dissatisfied, though more convinced than ever that the husband held the key. In the evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, where a few parishioners had assembled for tea and comfort. Conversation turned, inevitably, to crime. Mrs. Price Ridley, her voice cutting as ever, declared, "It is quite obvious that Miss Hargreaves is involved. She was always jealous of Mrs. Clement's baking, and jealousy, as everyone knows, can lead to dreadful things." Miss Hartnell, not to be outdone, insisted that Mr. Clement was the culprit. He never looked at her kindly, not once, and I dare say he fancied life would be easier without her sharp tongue. The vicar's wife, distressed by such talk, murmured that none of them should cast stones, but Miss Marple, sipping her tea, thought that these conversations revealed more about the speakers than about the crime. People projected their own irritations and fears onto the suspects. It was natural, human, and yet among the exaggerations, kernels of truth sometimes hid. As the evening drew to a close, a small incident occurred that pricked Miss Marple's attention. Sarah Sims, the grocer's daughter, had come to fetch her mother. While waiting in the hallway, she dropped her handbag, scattering its contents across the floor. Miss Marple, ever quick to help, bent down to retrieve a folded slip of paper that had fluttered beneath a chair. It was only a grocery list, but the handwriting made her pause. Neat, upright, and very like the fragment she had found in the parish hall drawer. Sarah snatched it up with a blush, thanking her hurriedly. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was alert. It was not yet a conclusion, merely another thread to tuck away. Walking home later, she reflected on the growing tangle of motives. Mrs. Clement's interference with Sarah Sims might indeed have bred resentment. Miss Hargreaves's trembling might conceal a deeper secret than fear. Mrs. Price Ridley's pride was sharp enough to wound, and Mr. Clement's indifference could mask more than laziness. Everyone, it seemed, had something to hide, and the village was fast becoming a stage upon which old grievances and quiet scandals played out. Back in her parlor, Miss Marple laid aside her shawl and considered the matter carefully. The inspector saw only the blunt outlines of motive, jealousy, quarrels, inheritance. But Miss Marple had learned that the truth often lay in the smaller things: the tone of a voice, the tremor of a hand, the choice of paper for a note. She glanced again at the torn scrap she had saved. Against the lamplight, the texture of it matched what she had glimpsed from Sarah Sims's list. She did not allow herself to leap ahead. Assumptions could be dangerous, but she was beginning to sense that the riddle written in baking measurements was less a flight of fancy than a deliberate construction, crafted by someone who knew the recipe of human weakness all too well. Outside, the village had grown quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The confrontations at the funeral and the gathering at the vicarage had stirred embers of resentment, and Miss Marple knew embers had a way of bursting into flame. She folded her knitting neatly and set it aside. Soon, she thought, another piece of the puzzle would show itself. It always did, when human nature was left to simmer. The village had scarcely caught its breath from the funeral when another disturbance unsettled its fragile calm. It came in the form of a discovery made early one morning by young Tommy Briggs, who delivered newspapers before school. Trotting down the lane behind the parish hall, he spotted something pale in the hedge. Curious, he pulled it free and found a folded sheet of paper, slightly damp with dew. Thinking at first it was only rubbish, he was about to toss it aside when the words written upon it caught his eye. Tommy could read well enough to know that the paper bore a strange list, much like the one Miss Hargreaves had read aloud at the Institute meeting. Only this one was different. In a shaky but legible hand it read, 1/2 pound of pride, 2 teaspoons of lies, a pinch of desperation, stir in fear until thick. Tommy, unnerved, ran straight to the grocer's with his find. By the time Miss Marple heard of it, the paper had already made its way to Inspector Slack. The inspector was triumphant. "Now we have something solid," he announced at the Blue Boar that afternoon. "Proof that this business with the recipe isn't a coincidence. Someone has been leaving these notes as part of their scheme. Mark my words, the culprit is getting careless." The men nodded gravely, though none could agree on who the culprit might be. Some insisted it pointed to Miss Hargreaves again, for she had handled the first paper. Others muttered about Sarah Sims, whose name had surfaced more than once in recent gossip. A few even whispered of Mr. Clement, saying that his calmness at the funeral was unnatural. Miss Marple, hearing all this, sat very still in her corner of the inn. Her eyes, however, were alive with thought. 2 recipes now, both couched in the language of baking, yet both spelling out emotions and flaws rather than ingredients. It was a curious pattern, and she could not help thinking that someone had chosen this method quite deliberately, as though taunting the village with the very weaknesses that seethed beneath its polite exterior. Later that day, she paid a call on Mrs. Bantry, who was brimming with the latest details. "Tommy Briggs is quite the hero, Jane. Imagine stumbling upon such a clue. It must mean the murderer is still at large and mocking us." Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled faintly. It is possible, Dolly, though one should remember that those who mock often do so out of fear. A bold gesture may conceal a trembling hand. Mrs. Bantry shivered with delight. You do it so cleverly. But what do you think it means? Pride, lies, desperation, fear. It all sounds dreadful. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she knitted a row. Human nature, Dolly. We each have our measure of it. But when the measures become unbalanced, the mixture can be quite dangerous. Meanwhile, Inspector Slack had grown more determined. He summoned Sarah Sims to the station for questioning. The poor girl, pale and nervous, insisted she knew nothing of the notes. She admitted that Mrs. Clement had scolded her sharply about walking out with a young man, but she swore she bore no malice. She always thought she had the right to interfere. Sarah said tearfully, "But I would never hurt her. Never." Slack was unconvinced. He pressed her about her handwriting, producing the second recipe for comparison. Sarah denied it was hers, though her trembling made the denial appear less convincing than she intended. When she was released, she hurried past Miss Marple on the high street, her eyes red from weeping. Miss Marple called gently after her, offering a kind word. The girl paused, then blurted out, "It isn't fair, Miss Marple. They all think it's me because I'm young and because she told me off. But I swear I didn't do it." Miss Marple laid a soft hand on her arm. "I know, my dear. People are quick to judge, especially when frightened. But truth has a way of showing itself, even if it hides for a time." Sarah managed a shaky smile before hurrying away. Miss Marple watched her go, reflecting that the girl's fear was genuine. But fear, again, could come from many sources, not all of them innocent. That evening brought still another revelation. The vicar's wife confided to Miss Marple that Mrs. Clement had recently hinted she possessed knowledge of a very unpleasant matter concerning someone in the village. She said it would come out sooner or later, the vicar's wife whispered, wringing her hands. At the time, I thought it was only her way of dramatizing things, but now I wonder. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Such hints were dangerous. To suggest one knew a secret was to invite both curiosity and hostility. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, where past indiscretions and present rivalries lay just beneath the surface, a single threat of exposure could be as potent as poison. The news of the second recipe spread quickly. The villagers were more unsettled than ever, for it seemed clear that the murderer was not finished. Some locked their doors earlier at night, others refused to drink tea at neighbors' houses. Mrs. Price Ridley declared she would not set foot in the parish hall again until the culprit was caught. Miss Hargreaves, increasingly pale, took to avoiding public gatherings altogether. Miss Marple, however, moved calmly through the storm. She listened, she observed, and she quietly added the new recipe to her notebook. Pride, lies, desperation, fear. They echoed the earlier list of regret, deceit, silence, envy. Together they painted a portrait not of a single person, but of a community riddled with hidden resentments. Yet within that portrait, she was certain, lay the hand of one particular artist. As she set down her pen that night, Miss Marple thought of how recipes could be altered, ingredients shifted, yet the essence remained. Whoever wrote these notes had chosen their metaphors carefully, and sooner or later they would make a mistake. She only hoped she would be ready to catch it when they did. By the end of the week, St. Mary Mead was in a state of hushed agitation. 2 recipe notes had been discovered, and Mrs. Clement's poisoning remained unsolved. Inspector Slack, for all his bluster, had not managed to produce either a confession or convincing evidence. The villagers, restless and suspicious, began watching one another with wary eyes. Even simple courtesies carried an undercurrent of mistrust. A loaf borrowed, a parcel delivered, a cup of tea offered, each seemed to conceal danger. Miss Marple, outwardly the same as ever, moved through this tense atmosphere with gentle serenity. Her neat figure, her soft voice, and her kind inquiries concealed a mind more alert than any constable's. She had learned long ago that the most revealing truths came when people believed themselves unobserved, or at least unchallenged. It was with this understanding that she set about her quiet testing. Her first visit was to Miss Hargreaves. The poor woman had been avoiding public view since the second note was found. When Miss Marple arrived at her small cottage, she found Miss Hargreaves pale and nervous, fussing with a stack of hymn sheets. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word about that paper? You see, I have been thinking it very curious. To choose baking terms of all things is rather an unusual fancy. It suggests, does it not, someone who is fond of such matters?" Miss Hargreaves flushed. I do enjoy baking, as we all do, but I did not write those dreadful things. Truly, Miss Marple, I had no hand in them. Reading the first aloud was foolish, I admit, but I never imagined it would end in tragedy." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Yes, indeed. Fear often makes us destroy what we should keep. Still, I could not help but notice the trembling of your hand that day. It reminded me of a girl I once knew who hid a broken engagement for months. She trembled whenever anyone mentioned weddings, poor souls. Secrets can weigh very heavily." Miss Hargreaves looked startled, then shook her head quickly. "I have no such secrets." Yet her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted it quietly, as she noted the small pile of unopened letters on the side table. Her next stop was the grocer's, where Sarah Sims was assisting her father. Miss Marple purchased a pound of flour, remarking as she did so, "Your handwriting on the labels is very neat, my dear. It must take patience to keep such order." Sarah blushed, glancing nervously at her father. "It is just practice, Miss Marple. Nothing more." But the faintest flicker crossed her face, a flicker Miss Marple caught. It was not guilt so much as fear of being judged. The girl was carrying more than she wished to reveal. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Price Ridley outside the post office. The woman was brisk, her chin high but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "I suppose they still suspect me, Miss Marple." Ridiculous, of course. I told the inspector precisely what I thought of his insinuations. Quarrels at committee meetings hardly make murderers. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "True enough, though I have sometimes observed that the most bitter quarrels are those about small things. A lady I once knew lost her friendship of 20 years over the lending of a sewing pattern." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "People can be very petty." Her words carried irony, and Miss Marple thought again how pride had been one of the ingredients listed in the second note. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire and considered what she had observed. She had not accused nor even hinted directly, yet each person had revealed something in their response. Miss Hargreaves's trembling secrecy, Sarah Sims's fearful blush, Mrs. Price Ridley's prideful defiance were parts of the mixture. The following day, a small gathering was held at the vicarage to discuss charitable funds. Miss Marple attended, her knitting in hand. She listened as the ladies argued mildly over which cause should take precedence, and she watched as subtle barbs were exchanged beneath the surface. When Mrs. Bantry praised Sarah Sims's neat account book, Mrs. Price Ridley remarked coldly that neatness was of little use without honesty. Sarah flushed, Miss Hargreaves fidgeted, and the vicar's wife tried to smooth things over. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had seen such scenes many times before. In village life, the most telling moments were not the grand declarations, but the small reactions, a glance, a blush, a silence. They revealed more than words ever could. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered behind with the vicar's wife. "My dear," she said quietly, "did Mrs. Clement ever speak of these recipe papers to you?" The vicar's wife hesitated. "Only once. She said she had found something clever in the suggestion box. She laughed about it, but later I thought she looked troubled." She put the paper in her handbag. That is the last I saw of it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Handbags can hold many things, sometimes more than one paper. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected that the notes were no prank. They were deliberate, written by someone who understood the village too well. Pride, envy, regret, lies, silence, fear. These were not random words. They were drawn from life, from the very characters around her. The recipes were not just riddles, they were portraits. At her cottage, she set her knitting aside and opened her notebook again. She added a line beneath the copied recipes. Each paper a mirror. Who fears the reflection? The answer, she knew, would come soon. A criminal might weave elaborate disguises, but human nature always betrays itself in the end. And Miss Marple, with her quiet testing, was beginning to see the first threads of unraveling. The Sunday following Mrs. Clement's funeral brought with it a thin drizzle that turned the lanes slick and the churchyard sodden. Yet despite the dreary weather, the pews at St. Mary Mead were fuller than usual. It seemed that everyone felt the need for reassurance, for some semblance of order in a village still unsettled by whispers of poison and cryptic recipes. The hymns were sung with unusual fervor, as though to ward off the shadow of suspicion. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual seat, her hands folded on her lap. She noticed how certain eyes lingered on others during the prayers. Mrs. Price Ridley's chin was held especially high, as if daring anyone to accuse her. Miss Hargreaves bowed her head but fidgeted throughout the sermon, while Sarah Sims looked pale, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The congregation, instead of being united in worship, seemed divided into camps of mistrust. After the service, the vicar announced that the parish hall would reopen in the afternoon for the continuation of institute matters. Some gasped, others muttered, but the decision stood. "We cannot let fear prevent us from carrying on our duties," he said firmly. "Evil must not be allowed to win by silencing us." His words were brave, though his wife's anxious expression betrayed her unease. That afternoon the hall was filled again, though the usual cheer of tea and cakes was notably absent. Instead, chairs were arranged in a circle, and the women gathered with tense faces. Inspector Slack attended too, claiming he wished to keep order, though it was clear he hoped to overhear something useful. The meeting had scarcely begun when a startling event occurred. Mrs. Bantry, rummaging in the cupboard for old committee minutes, gave a sharp cry. She had discovered another folded paper tucked among the ledgers. The women crowded around, exclaiming, while Slack snatched it from her hand. He unfolded it slowly, his lips tightening as he read aloud. 3 ounces of shame, a cup of secrets pressed down, 2 spoons of bitterness, a dash of revenge. Leave to settle in darkness. A hush fell over the room. The words, more ominous than ever, seemed to settle like a chill mist. Several women crossed themselves. Miss Hargreaves let out a faint gasp, while Mrs. Price Ridley muttered, "This is intolerable." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "It's the same hand, without doubt. This is no prank. Someone is taunting us again, and if I may say so, rather enjoying it. And mark me, each of these notes has come from this hall. The guilty party is among you." The women bristled, some indignant, others fearful. The vicar's wife protested that such accusations would destroy the harmony of the parish. Slack ignored her, striding about the room as though daring someone to confess. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed quietly from her seat near the back. Her knitting needles were still, but her mind worked swiftly. The new recipe, with its mixture of shame, secrets, bitterness, and revenge, seemed more pointed than the others. It carried not only general flaws, but a sharper, more personal edge. Someone had written it with intent, and Miss Marple suspected that the intent was to unsettle, to frighten, perhaps even to provoke a misstep. That evening the village could talk of nothing else. Doors closed earlier than usual, curtains twitched, and speculation spread like wildfire. Some were convinced that the murderer was setting out a pattern, like a series of grim announcements leading to another crime. Others argued that the notes were diversions, meant to cast suspicion everywhere and nowhere at once. In the midst of this turmoil, Sarah Sims came once more to Miss Marple's cottage. Her eyes were red, her hands clenched. "They will never believe me, Miss Marple. Now with this third note, they will say it was me. They always say it is me." Miss Marple drew her gently inside and offered her a chair by the fire. "My dear, people are often quick to place blame where it seems easiest, but you must not despair. Truth has a way of working itself out." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. Mrs. Clements, who threatened to tell my father about John. She said she would ruin everything for me. That is why they all think I did it. But I swear I never touched her tea." Miss Marple's expression softened. "I do understand, child, far more than you think. And I also know that fear of exposure does not always equal guilt of murder." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while by the fire. Sarah had revealed something important. Mrs. Clement's interference had been more serious than idle scolding. She had threatened to expose a secret relationship. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, were dangerous things in villages. They grew heavy, they warped behavior, and sometimes they drove people to desperate acts. But still, Sarah's youth and her frightened honesty spoke against her being the architect of these carefully written notes. The recipes were not the work of a panicked girl, but of someone with patience, calculation, and a taste for symbolism. The next morning, Miss Marple attended to her garden, clipping the withered roses. She thought of the third recipe note, with its emphasis on shame and revenge. It was a sharper blade than the first two, and she wondered whether the writer was becoming bolder or more desperate. Either way, the village could not remain balanced on this knife edge forever. Another revelation was coming. She felt it in her bones, and when it came, it would shift the pattern once again. She wiped her hands, set aside her clippers, and gazed thoughtfully down the quiet lane. Somewhere behind the curtained windows of St. Mary Mead, the truth was waiting, and she, patient as ever, would be ready to see it when it stepped into the light. The third recipe note had set the village trembling, and Inspector Slack responded with renewed fervor. He strode about the lanes as though sheer presence might flush out the culprit, and he announced that he would soon have matters settled. Yet his manner betrayed irritation. The notes, rather than narrowing the field, had only spread suspicion wider. It seemed that every villager was under a shadow. Miss Marple, however, had begun to see a clearer outline. The pattern of the recipes told her something about the mind behind them. They were not the frantic scribbles of panic, but deliberate compositions, each balanced with care. Whoever wrote them possessed both a taste for words and a sharp understanding of human weaknesses. That was not Sarah Sims, nor the blustering Mrs. Price Ridley. It was someone more calculating. She decided the time had come for a quiet test. Not a dramatic trap, such as Inspector Slack might imagine, but a gentle prod at the fabric of concealment to see where it would tear. The opportunity arose at a small gathering in Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room. A number of ladies were present, including Miss Hargreaves, Mrs. Price Ridley, and Sarah Sims, with the inspector dropping in under the pretense of keeping an eye on things. The conversation, as expected, circled endlessly around the murder and the recipe notes. Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her needles clicking softly. She waited until the talk grew heated. With Mrs. Price, Ridley declared that the culprit must be punished with the utmost severity, and Miss Hargreaves weeping into her handkerchief. Then, in her mildest voice, Miss Marple spoke. "It does strike me," she said, "that these recipes are rather like diaries, a way of writing down feelings without naming names. I dare say if one were to write such a thing, it would be difficult not to let a little of oneself creep in." There was a pause. The ladies exchanged glances. Sarah looked bewildered. Mrs. Price, Ridley sniffed, and Miss Hargreaves' hands trembled visibly. Inspector Slack narrowed his eyes at Miss Marple, uncertain of her purpose. Miss Marple smiled benignly. Of course, I have no talent for such writing myself, but I do remember a dear cousin of mine who kept little verses in the margin of her cookery book. Very ingenious, though perhaps not meant for others to see. With that, she let the remark hang in the air, and she returned to her knitting. She said nothing further, but she watched. It was in such moments, she knew, that people revealed themselves. Miss Hargreaves dropped her teacup with a clatter, spilling tea across the table. She apologized profusely, flustered and near tears. Mrs. Price Ridley muttered that it was all too much, while Sarah Sims looked from one to another with frightened eyes. Miss Marple noted each reaction carefully, storing it away. Later, as the gathering broke up, she lingered by the door, engaging Miss Hargreaves in gentle conversation. "Such a pity about your teacup, my dear. Though I dare say nerves will do such things. It reminds me of a young woman I once knew who grew terribly anxious whenever anyone came close to discovering her secret correspondences. She, too, had a fondness for writing in unusual forms." Miss Hargreaves blanched, stammered something about feeling unwell, and hurried off into the night. Miss Marple watched her go, thoughtful. It was not yet proof, but it was another stitch in the fabric she was quietly weaving. That evening, she sat by her fire, reviewing the matter. The first recipe had spoken of regret, deceit, silence, envy. The second of pride, lies, desperation, fear. The third of shame, secrets, bitterness, revenge. Together they formed not only a portrait of human flaws, but a progression, as if someone were building to a conclusion. And in each, Miss Marple sensed the hand of a person who both feared exposure and sought to control the story. The inspector, impatient as ever, called upon her the next day. "You were stirring things up at Mrs. Bantry's," he accused. "If you've something to say, Miss Marple, best to say it plain." "I don't hold riddles." She looked at him mildly. "Oh, I do not think we are at the end of the matter yet, Inspector. Little more patience may reveal the truth. People often betray themselves when they believe they are safe." Slack grumbled, muttered about interference, and departed. Yet Miss Marple felt certain her quiet test had struck the right note. The trembling hand, the nervous flight, the hidden secrecy, all were signs that the mask was slipping. As she set aside her knitting that night, she thought of how cakes, once in the oven, rose in their own time. One could not rush them, nor open the door too soon, or they would collapse. So it was with human nature. The murderer had mixed their ingredients carefully, but already cracks were showing. It would not be long, Miss Marple knew, before the cake split and the truth rose to the surface. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm, but her eyes watchful. The final reveal was drawing nearer. The village, still thrumming with gossip, did not yet know it, but the riddle in the baking measurements was almost ready to be solved. The following evening brought with it a damp fog that curled low over the hedges and crept across the lanes of St. Mary Mead. It was in this heavy atmosphere that Miss Marple decided the moment had come to draw the threads together. The village could not endure much longer under suspicion and fear, nor could the murderer be allowed to grow bolder with each passing day. She invited Inspector Slack, Mrs. Bantry, and a handful of those most closely entangled, Miss Hargreaves, Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Clement, and young Sarah Sims, to gather at her cottage. The inspector scoffed at first, muttering that it was no business of hers, but curiosity and perhaps a grudging respect compelled him to attend. The others came nervously, sensing that Miss Marple would not summon them without reason. The little parlor was warm and welcoming, the fire burning brightly, the scent of lavender faint in the air. Yet beneath the homeliness lay tension. Chairs were drawn close, teacups were untouched, and eyes darted toward one another with unease. Miss Marple, seated in her usual armchair with her knitting in her lap, looked as placid as ever. "My dear friends," she began softly, "I do not wish to alarm you, but I feel we must at last speak plainly. 3 strange papers have been found, each written as though a recipe, but not for any cake or pudding. Rather, they listed ingredients of human weakness, regret, envy, pride, lies, shame, revenge. Such things are not chosen idly. They were chosen by someone who knew this village well, who understood its quarrels and its secrets. Someone who wished to frighten, to unsettle, and finally to conceal a crime." Inspector Slack shifted impatiently. "All very fine, Miss Marple, but what has that to do with Mrs. Clement's death? We need facts, not fancies." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "Indeed, Inspector, let us consider facts. Mrs. Clement was poisoned at the parish hall tea. She had in her handbag a curious paper, later destroyed by Miss Hargreaves in fear. Before her death, she hinted to more than one person that she knew of a serious secret. And since her passing, further papers have been found, each echoing the first, each more pointed." She turned her eyes upon the group. "Now, who would have both the inclination and the opportunity to write such notes? Not young Sarah. Her fear is genuine, but she has neither style nor calculation. Not Mrs. Price Ridley either, for her pride would never stoop to such games. And not Mr. Clement, whose indifference is real enough, but whose indolence forbids such elaborate craft. That leaves another." Miss Hargreaves gave a little cry. "You cannot mean," but Miss Marple raised her hand. "You, Miss Hargreaves, are indeed the one I mean. Your trembling, your evasions, your destruction of the first paper, they were not the marks of innocence but of concealment. You wrote those recipes, you slipped them into the suggestion box and into the cupboard, hoping to weave confusion and dread. You thought to disguise your guilt in symbolism, as though the village itself were to blame. But the style was unmistakable. Your fondness for lists, your precise hand, the way you phrased your hymn notes matched too well." The room held its breath. Miss Hargreaves' face had gone chalk white. Mrs. Bantry stared in horror, while Mrs. Price Ridley muttered, "I knew it." Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Clement, I believe, discovered something about you. She found one of your papers before the meeting, and intended to reveal it. Perhaps it hinted at some indiscretion, some long-hidden shame. You feared exposure. And so, when the Institute gathered, you made certain her teacup was not harmless. The poison slipped in with quiet skill. And afterward, to divert suspicion, you produced the paper as though it were a curiosity, never expecting it would become the very thread that led back to you." Inspector Slack frowned. "That's a heavy accusation, Miss Marple. Do you have proof beyond handwriting and nerves?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "There is the torn scrap of quality paper I found in the parish hall drawer. It matches precisely the stationery you use for your letters, and there is the account of Miss Hartnell, who saw Mrs. Clement with an envelope that day. She had intercepted your note, had she not? That is why she looked troubled. That is why she became dangerous to you." Miss Hargreaves pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, trembling. No denial came, only silence. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her words were steady. It was not hatred of Mrs. Clement as a woman, but fear of what she might reveal. Yet, in striving to bury your secret, you wove a web too intricate. Human nature betrays itself. Pride, envy, deceit, they do not lie quietly on a page. They rise, just as a cake rises, and they cannot be hidden. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Inspector Slack cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Well, Miss Hargreaves, you'll have to answer to the law now. I'll see to it." Miss Hargreaves gave a low sob, her composure breaking at last. She buried her face in her hands, while the others looked on in a mixture of shock and pity. Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, rose gently. "It is a sad business," she said softly. "A crime born not of greed or vengeance alone, but of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of shame. But fear, my dear, is a poor counselor. It leads only to darker paths." She glanced toward the fire, its glow casting long shadows across the room. And thus, the riddle in the baking measurements is solved. Each recipe was a mirror of the mind that wrote it, and in the end, it revealed what it sought to hide. The little parlor was very still. The case that had haunted the village now had its answer, though the weight of it would linger. Miss Marple's gentle voice had laid bare the truth, and with it came the somber knowledge of how small flaws, when mixed together, could yield a most deadly result. The days that followed Miss Hargreaves's unmasking were heavy with a peculiar silence. St. Mary Mead, usually abuzz with the clatter of gossip, found itself subdued. The villagers still whispered, of course they always would, but the tone had changed. Instead of wild speculation, there was now a quiet, almost reverent acknowledgement of what had been revealed. Miss Hargreaves had been taken into custody under Inspector Slack's watch, though he carried himself with less triumph than usual. The case had been solved not through his persistent questioning, but through Miss Marple's gentle deductions, a fact the village did not fail to notice. Slack muttered something about handwriting analysis and official tests, but in truth he knew, as did everyone, that Miss Marple's calm observation had pointed directly to the truth. In her little cottage, Miss Marple resumed her usual routine. She tended her roses, arranged her knitting, and poured tea as though life had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Yet her mind, though satisfied, was not untouched by sorrow. She thought often of Miss Hargreaves, a woman whose precise habits and starched collars had hidden a fearful heart. Fear had led her down a path from which there was no return. Miss Marple reflected that it was not malice alone, but dread of exposure that had driven her, and that, in some ways, made the tragedy all the sharper. Mrs. Bantry visited frequently during those days, eager to discuss every detail. "It still amazes me, Jane," she said one afternoon, leaning forward with wide eyes. "Those notes, those dreadful recipes. Why, I should never have connected them as you did. To think they were her way of confessing, even while she tried to conceal her guilt. Positively chilling." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Dolly, people often reveal themselves in the very act of hiding. It is much like embroidery. The pattern on the front may be neat, but the back shows all the knots and tangles. Miss Hargreaves stitched her own undoing with every word she wrote. Mrs. Price Ridley, though outwardly gratified that suspicion had shifted away from her, carried herself with even more hauteur than usual. She declared to anyone who would listen that she had never doubted her own innocence, and she hinted heavily that her sharp mind had suspected Miss Hargreaves all along. Few believed her, but no one contradicted her too directly. Sarah Sims, released from suspicion, walked the high street with her head held a little higher. She came once more to Miss Marple's cottage to thank her. "I don't know what would have become of me, Miss Marple, if they had gone on thinking I was guilty. You saved me." Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. "You saved yourself, my dear, by telling the truth. Lies are heavy things, but honesty, even when painful, is lighter to carry. Remember that. The vicar and his wife, too, came to pay a visit. The vicar spoke gravely of the sin of fear and the snares of secrecy, while his wife wept quietly, lamenting the loss of both Mrs. Clement and Miss Hargreaves to the parish. Miss Marple listened, offering tea and gentle words, though in her heart she knew the lesson would fade with time. Villages healed slowly, but they healed all the same. The greatest change lay in the parish hall. For weeks afterward, the women entered with subdued expressions, their chatter hushed. The teapots were handled carefully, the cakes regarded with faint suspicion, as though poison might lurk still among the scones. Yet gradually, as the weeks passed, the old rhythm returned. New quarrels arose over tablecloths and hymn selections, and Mrs. Bantry's laughter rang out once more. The hall, like the village, began to forget. But Miss Marple didn't forget. One evening, as the autumn wind rattled the window panes, she sat by her fire and opened her notebook. There, in her neat hand, were the copied recipes: regret, deceit, silence, envy, pride, lies, desperation, fear, shame, secrets, bitterness, revenge. She read them slowly, tracing the arc of Miss Hargreaves' descent. Each note had been a step deeper into panic, each a symbol of the weight she carried, until at last it crushed her. Miss Marple closed the book and set it aside. She thought of how very ordinary Miss Hargreaves had seemed, like another spinster, precise in manner, faithful in attendance, always ready with a hymn sheet. Yet beneath the starch and order had lain a heart consumed by fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was more deadly than hate, for it made people act against their very nature. The fire crackled, and the clock ticked softly. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and reflected, as she so often did, on the nature of humanity. People believed themselves guided by reason, but in truth they were swayed by smaller things, by pride, by envy, by the longing to conceal some shame. She had seen it time and again in her long years in St. Mary Mead, and she knew she would see it again. Outside, the village settled back into its nightly quiet. Curtains were drawn, lamps glowed warmly, and the drizzle gave way to a clear sky. Life, though scarred by the memory of poison and cryptic notes, had resumed its course. Miss Marple sat in her chair, her knitting folded neatly beside her, and allowed herself a moment of peace. The riddle, written in baking measurements, had been solved, its ingredients sifted and weighed. But the lesson remains that beneath the surface of the most ordinary village lay a recipe for tragedy, needing only the right mixture of secrecy and fear to bring it to life. She sipped her tea, her expression calm, and let the firelight flicker over her thoughtful face. For Miss Marple, the solving of a crime was never about triumph, but about understanding the frailties of human hearts. And in St. Mary Mead, she knew, there would always be more hearts to watch, more secrets to uncover, and more truths to sift from the chatter of village life.